This time on Poll Hub, approval ratings. We hear about them constantly for president, a governor, maybe your mayor. 53% of people think Sharon Smith is doing a good job, or only 40% of voters approve of Joe Jones's handling of the economy. But what does that really mean? Why is there often a pretty big spread across approval polls? How much can we really learn about how voters feel when you're just asking a simple approve, disapprove question? And how well do approval polls predict the future? Spoiler alert, they probably don't. This is Poll Hub. Let's get started. Hi, everybody. I'm Jay DeDapper, and with us today on Poll Hub, as always, the brain trust of the Marist Poll, Lee and Barb. Welcome.
Hey, we're very excited today. Have a little talk about some of the things we hold very close to our hearts. I'm Lee Miringoff, director of the Marist Institute for Public Opinion.
And I'm Barbara Carvalho, the director of the Marist Poll.
And we approve of this podcast. Approval ratings are what we're talking about right now because there's so much attention paid to this.
And there's so many of them.
And there's so many. And a lot of this does have to do with the president, obviously, in that we're talking about President Trump and approval ratings. There's daily tracking polls on approval, right? But it happens in all kinds of other races. But why is this something that is covered so much? Why is it something that gets so much attention? Is it just like a visceral thing that people can relate to? I like him, I don't like him?
Well, this has been going on for a long time. I don't think it's been focused on as much as it is now, but approval ratings started with FDR, and Gallup decided that would be a good way of measuring what the public thought of the president, instead of just having experts or the pundits or whoever had the biggest megaphone deciding how the president was doing. So I think originally it was probably kind of this democratic value of public opinion, and public opinion should be part of the process. That got the whole thing going.
And I think also, all these approval rating polls, they help everybody along with the narrative of what's going on. So it's sort of the one yardstick that we can compare over time to other presidents or anybody else at that particular point in time. So, if we're halfway into the first year of President Trump's time as president, we can compare him back over time. So there's nice trend analysis. It's sort of a common denominator. We can equalize everything out and say, how's this guy doing relative to others?
But now we've got all sorts of stuff and all sorts of polls. Back when it started, you had Gallup, then we have other polls. There was a Crosley poll, Roper poll, but there wasn't really anybody else doing this. So now what you have is all these different polls, different methodologies, sampling different type of people, asking different types of questions. So what is the approval rating?
So in one way,
I thought you were going to answer that. That was rhetorical, huh?
That was rhetorical. Okay. In one way, there are a lot of polls and a lot of different methodologies you talk about. But for the most part, with this president, so far over the course of his term, they've been pretty consistent in terms of direction. Is that a better way to look at approval polls, is what the direction is, as opposed to today 44% say this, but in another poll 38% say that? Is that discrepancy somewhat irrelevant compared to the trend?
Absolutely. And I think what we've seen right now is a convergence of all the polls. We've seen a president, in President Trump, that started kind of lukewarm after his inauguration, half of the folks, thinking he's doing a good job and half not. What we've seen in all of the polls, regardless of all those details that we may want to talk a little bit more about, is that we have seen a decline in his approval rating and an increase in his disapproval. And this has really gone on over the last several months.
See, there's two things you can do with all this. You can take one poll and follow it over time, so at least you have everything equalized. You've eliminated what we call house effects. So you're not
house effects. We'll have to do an entire podcast on that.
It's one organization measuring the poll.
I see.
Over time, or you can sort of throw them all together, as some of the aggregators do, and right now there's a whole bunch of polls out, and what are they collectively saying? And right now they're collectively saying that Donald Trump, has his base. He really hasn't reached out. His numbers, have hit into the 30s. We can look historically at what that means. And then we can also see the disapproval on those. And there's some variation in the polls. And then you want to drill down if you want to see why one poll is showing Trump a little bit better or a little bit worse than other polls, there's ways of possibly explaining that.
So do that. Well, why? Because you can name polls if you want. I don't really care.
Well, I think
there's a broad range here.
Well, let me tell you one thing I look at. The first thing I look at, I mean, these are samples of Americans, and you want to say, well who did
not
they?
all the time.
Yeah, that's true also. Why don't you go there and then I'll come back?
They poll Russians too? What do you mean it's not polls of Americans?
Well, each organization very often chooses to poll a subset of Americans. There are a few groups, such as the Marist Poll, NBC News polls adults and Americans overall, but many of the other polls that we see are actually looking and talking to just registered voters. So you're taking all Americans and now you're narrowing that down to people who are just registered or who say they're registered to vote. And then there are also a couple polls, like the Rasmussen poll, who looks at and speaks to likely voters. So they not only start with Americans, ask if they're registered to vote, but then they ask a couple questions about, well, how likely are you to vote? And I'm not even sure when and how that can be defined.
But if they're asking likely, I mean, if I'm sitting back and looking at these and listening to you guys, and I say, well, wait a second. Well, why not likely voters? If I want to know the approval rating and how that's going to affect whether the guy gets reelected or gets anything done, shouldn't I be looking at likely voters since they're the ones who are going to vote?
Do you know who the likely voter is for 2018, 2020, 2040, 2080 right now?
That's not my job. That's your job.
Well, the answer is you really can't because you're not in the context of that campaign.
For what? So we have a number of elections coming up this November, local elections. We're going to be seeing local elections throughout the country. Mm-hmm. We have a couple of governor's races this time around. But likely to vote when?
Yeah. And very often, just so the folks know that, I mean, we look at sort of a registered voter pool and then a likely voter pool, sometimes not switching over until after Labor Day of the year of the election. So that talks a little bit about the Rasmussen poll and why we don't necessarily think that's particularly good. But there was one other point I was going to make a little bit earlier, and we don't want to leave things on the table, right, Jay?
Well, you don't want to bang the table.
No. That's probably
podcast production.
That's probably.
What were you going to leave on the table? Don't leave it on the table.
I was going to talk about Khrushchev burying us all with pounding his shoe on the table, but that's probably a limited reference right now.
Well, certainly a limited audience.
Limited audience, yes. So one of the things we look at, so why a poll might be a little different, given that these are done by maybe two organizations that are legitimate scientific based polls. Let's take a recent case of the ABC Washington Post poll.
Got a lot of attention. Because it showed the lowest number ever for Trump and the worst for a president since FDR.
And his disapproval was pushing 60%. Compared, let's say, with our poll, the Marist poll that we did with NPR and PBS, and that one had Trump also below 40, but in the low 50s in terms of his disapproval. So the other poll was showing Trump worse than we were, but they were both showing him not doing so hot. So then we drill down, we take a look. First thing I look at is what is the spread in those polls between Democrats and Republicans that they interviewed. And surprise, surprise, in the ABC Washington Post poll, there was a wider spread. They had more Democrats relative to what we had than Republicans. Not surprising, then, that they would find Donald Trump to be in worse shape because they had more Democrats. Margin of 12% there. The gap was at 12. We had a +5. So our numbers had closer between Democrats and Republicans. And that might help explain, if you wanted to look at why Trump was doing a little better in our poll than their poll, that would explain it.
But for somebody who just talks about polls on Twitter, like a lot of people seem to do, they're going to say, well, that's the bias. They picked 12, you picked 5. Why didn't you pick 0?
I was going to ask the same thing, which how does that actually happen? And we don't set it. It isn't actually a bias. It's a question that's asked, and we ask people that we're speaking with to describe what they consider themselves at this point in time. Are they a Democrat, an independent, a Republican? And so they just tell us what they think of themselves. It's not how they're registered. It's not how they've voted in the past. It's simply their subjective opinion about which party they align with or neither party.
So did the Washington Post get more Democrats saying they were Democrats? Is that how they got 12 and you got +5?
It does vary over time, and it depends upon
That's a big gap, isn't it?
It is a big.
I mean,
it
on a
is a big gap.
percentage basis, that's a big percentage difference.
Yeah. And so I think that, yes, so that's something you want to know about when you're looking at these polls. But Barbara touched upon something that was, I think, very important. One of the big misconceptions about polls generally is that pollsters model to some electorate that they're going to think is out there. So, they're thinking the electorate's going to be such and such this and such that, and maybe they were, quote, wrong because it doesn't look like it was 4 years ago. But in fact, what we do and what responsible scientific polls do is you don't model it to anything. You let the voters indicate, if you're picking them at random in a scientific representative way, you're going to get a certain party distribution. Now, does that mean we were doing things differently than the ABC Washington Post was? Well, maybe at some level. It's different interviewers, it's different methods of drawing a sample, different question wording perhaps. Sometimes people say, why are polls so different if they're both scientific? And I always look at it and, well, why are polls so similar? Why are all these polls out now showing the same narrative when they're all interviewing about 1,000 people around the country, which doesn't sound like enough?
But you just got questions, and that's always really interesting to me is, if I'm called and somebody asks me, do you approve or disapprove of the job somebody does, I don't have a black and white answer for that. I mean, no, I
You don't have an opinion?
I do have an opinion.
Okay, that's all we're asking for.
There's a big difference between an opinion and being asked for a black and white answer to that. Are there ways, and is it practical to ask questions that get at the gray? Because there's plenty of people who probably think that Donald Trump or their mayor or their governor is okay on some things, and maybe they don't like him or her on some other things. Just the up and down, approve, disapprove seems like it doesn't really tell me very much, and I'm not able to answer that question very well if I'm asked that. Is that fair, or am I just like being a nitpicker?
Well, no, and we don't.
Never,
and
never
the
have
thing
you
is,
been
although
accused of that.
Although we worry that we're going to be taking too much time to find out what your opinion is about the president or a governor or whomever we're talking about, we do ask a lot of other questions. I think the up and down question is a way of summarizing what people think that's easily communicated. But there's generally much more that goes into a poll. Sometimes even with that one question. We can have an up and down. Other polls sometimes ask a range. We like to use intensity. We call it intensity. So you either, you might have approve, disapprove, but you put the approve on one side and the disapprove on the other. And if disapprove means, is a 1 and approve is a 10, where would you place yourself on that range when thinking about the job President Trump is doing?
Or if someone says, I sort of guess I approve of them. And then you can follow up with, do you strongly approve, somewhat approve? So we're getting now, and that's very important because at the extremes, the strongly approve and the strongly disapprove are much different. Barb alluded to in the beginning that, it started out with some lukewarm feelings. But what has happened since? Well, he's down now to his base. And that we pick up on the intensity question. So the dislike has gotten more intense over time.
But understand, we want to make it as clear as possible. We don't want to be reading into what you're saying to us. So although approve, disapprove may seem, very surfacey, and I didn't really get into what your opinion is really about, at least it's something we both agree on. We know what approval means, and we know what disapproval means. So I'm not in any way tainting your opinion or the interpretation of that. One of the questions that often gets asked too is excellent, good, fair, or poor in rating someone. Well, what does fair mean? Generally, we think of it as a negative, but some people think, especially in the Northeast, if you get a fair, boy, you're doing okay.
You haven't been indicted yet. Okay, that's how you doing? Fair,
So when we talk about that intensity, does that, when you're looking at intensity over a period of time, does that give you the opportunity or the ability to look at polls and use them, approval polls, and use them in some predictive way? And I know that there's a can of worms when you talk to pollsters about predictive. We don't predict. This is a snapshot in time, right?
Yeah, so it's a portrait of voters.
Right. But is there more value, or is there a way to use the intensity that you see over time to kind of model out or predict what would happen in the future.
And we do that all the time, especially when we're asking people about whether they're going to vote or not. It's not that people who don't have a lot of intensity towards either a person, a politician, or something that they're going to do in the future may not do it, but we deal in probabilities, which means the likelihood of something is going to happen. And people are much more likely to do something, to act, and to follow through if they have a strong intensity, either favorable or unfavorable.
And then we do know certain patterns. I mean, not everything is episodic. There's certain things that do repeat themselves. So if you have someone who's low approval ratings and he only has his base support like Donald Trump, is that surprising that that would be the folks who would be still with him? Well, not necessarily, because the base would be the last thing to crack. So it makes sense that first you shed your soft support, and then you're left with your core, and that's really where we're going to be looking at in the coming months with Donald Trump is, where does the base go? And if he starts dipping lower, then there's got to be a crack there, because that's the group he's going to lose.
So the change we've seen so far in his approval rating from when he was in the mid-40s right after his inauguration to now when he's in the mid to high 30s is that we've seen a fall off among what we call soft Republicans, or people who consider themselves to be Republicans, but not really strongly. At some point, they may even consider themselves to be an independent, leaning towards being a Republican, or think of themselves as perhaps voting more often for Republicans. So we've seen the deterioration in his approval rating among that group. The other group is among independents, and he did very well among independents in the election, and in many states, that's what changed the outcome. So those are the things that we're seeing. And so when you ask about intensity, we're looking not just intensity of support, but we're also looking about intensity of partisanship, because if nothing else, this is a very, very polarized electorate. He's not going to gain Democrats. He's not going to lose so many Republicans. So we're really looking at those folks that are.
And it's our job. It's our job to talk about. Look, everybody. That's why we exist. So we're totally, straightening this out and figuring things out and helping communicate these results in a meaningful way to folks, because that's what we're supposed to do.
So there's another story that we want to talk about another politician whose base has crumbled a whole lot more, perhaps, than Donald Trump's has, nearing the end of his term. Chris Christie,
yes,
governor
term-limited New Jersey governor.
On his way out the door of the State House in Trenton, New Jersey. This is a guy who really captured national attention in a way that was very similar in some ways to Donald Trump. He was the guy who would walk into the china shop and break the china, right? He was the bull in the china shop. Trump out-bulled him, or whatever you want to call it. And then there's been a whole lot of other scandals and problems and things like that. But you guys have a new poll out, and boy, he is they're just kicking him out. The voters are basically saying, don't hurt yourself on the way out. Goodbye.
If you want to see what a politician looks like, an incumbent looks like, a chief executive, when the base has cracked and disintegrated, look across the Hudson River from where we are to Governor Christie. I mean, his approval rating overall is at 16%. So if you think Donald Trump's 35 to 40 is hurting, look at these numbers in comparison. He's only getting 32 among Republicans in New Jersey. So you're looking at someone, as I say, the base has really cracked there, and he's down to really, the course lowest point of any governor in the country today, lowest point of any governor in the history of New Jersey. You can just say it so many different ways. This is a guy whose time has passed.
What's interesting to me about some of this anyway, and looking through the numbers that you guys have produced, one of the things that really strikes me is that this is a guy, and you can't, in New Jersey, you can't win without independence. You can't win as a Democrat, you can't win as a Republican. This
it's
is
a blue state.
It's a blue state, but it's a state that you need independence even as a Democrat to win.
But
and
Clinton did win by double digits.
Right, okay. But Christie, won 2 terms as a Republican, and there's been Republican governors before, and they have won on the strength of independence. And independents have essentially completely abandoned Chris Christie, and it has affected their perception of Republicans. For instance, there's a governor's race coming up. Almost nobody will have heard of the two candidates because Chris Christie sucks all the oxygen out of the room in terms of being an attention guy.
Exactly.
But this has affected Republicans, the Republican brand in New Jersey, big time.
Enormously. I mean, independents actually rate Chris Christie about as what Democrats do. It's barely in double digits.
Yeah, and as we talked about approval rating earlier, if you have an election where an incumbent is seeking re-election, the approval rating sometimes talks to him and tells us, well, is this going to be a referendum on the incumbent? And, how's the incumbent doing? But right now, we have a race that's open in a sense that there is no incumbent except
because his lieutenant governor is running, does have the Republican nomination to run in November. So,
but let's be honest,
she is going to be carrying.
And the first thing she said was that she wants to sell that beach house that
everybody saw him on 4th of July.
She wants to put as much distance as herself.
But it's really hard. It's really hard because also people in New Jersey overwhelmingly think that the state is going in the wrong direction. And they overwhelmingly want to change the policies of the Christie administration. They want to turn the page on this administration.
So does this say anything to Democrats nationwide? There's only one other gubernatorial race, and that's Virginia, where Terry McAuliffe, he's term limited. In Virginia, you only get one term, and then you're gone. Democrat, Republican, obviously running there, closer, at least in the polls that I've seen, than what these guys are in New Jersey. These are the only two races that are going to get attention this fall. Does this, what you're seeing in this poll, especially with the intensity of support for Donald Trump among the voters in New Jersey, does that get you closer to understanding what 2017 is looking like as a good or a bad year because of Trump for either party?
I mean, if the Democrats lost the governorship in New Jersey, that would be a big story. If they reclaim the seat of the State House, that's probably less of a story.
And who has spent more time in New Jersey than he has in his home of New York City over the last 6 months?
I haven't a clue. Who is that?
Donald Trump, right? He's
really?
been at Bedminster at his golf course. He spent more time in Jersey than almost any place.
I don't know how much golfing connects.
No, but he's the one who
especially when people are worried about health care and the economy and taxes.
What I'm saying is that he's the one who said, New Jersey's in play. They like me in Jersey. I'm a Jersey guy, right?
He was going to win. He was going to win New York State too.
Understood. But Jersey doesn't. Jersey seemed a more likely opportunity, if still far-fetched. This seems to suggest that at least as you start to dig into the states and the state polls, which we're going to start to see more of now that we're past the 6-month mark, that in states like New Jersey, Donald Trump is hurting the brand of the Republican Party in states where the Republican brand cannot afford to be hurt.
That's right.
Is that fair?
And there are other states also, the ones that he surprised in last November, the Pennsylvanias and the Michigans and the Wisconsins, those are also going to be on the table. But, look at Chris Christie, the Bridgegate, the recent episode with the beach. I mean, he's following in a tradition of Jersey politicians. Despite his arrival as the new guy who was going to change things, I mean, I was looking through I couldn't believe all the mayors and all the senators.
It's not just the indictments. Jim McGreevey, he had his own special scandal. John Corzine, it's just one after another after another.
So if Chris Christie has had problems with voters as a politician in New Jersey, he's certainly in good company.
Absolutely. Well, that's Poll Hub for today, and we want to get your questions, right? I mean, one of the most important things that we do here is to try and understand what your questions are about polls so we can answer them, to try and demystify all this. So send your questions to pollhub@marist.edu. And Barb, you're going to answer those all personally, aren't you?
I am, absolutely.
And check out Poll Hub on social media. We're on Marist Poll on Twitter, Marist Poll on Facebook, Snapchat, Instagram. Everywhere you go, there is the Marist Poll.
That sounded a little like Bill Clinton imitation.
I'll do my imitations in another.
We'll hold those.
Oh, can't wait.
We'll hold those.
Can't wait.
We'll hold those.
We'll hold those. All right, guys. Thanks. We'll see you next time on Poll Hub.